There's another aspect to this conflict which has been getting some, but not equal media attention, and that is the quite dramatic, and one might say, a turning point in the Israel-Palestine conflict at the legal, at the moral, and at the public opinion level. I'll collapse all three: legal, moral, public opinion level. And for some of your listeners, it's particularly revealing of what's happening in the American Jewish community. Now, let me just try to back up and put things in context. First, the major development. The major development is this past week, Human Rights Watch, which, as you know, is the leading human rights organization in the world. It's the most prominent, the most influential, the most well-endowed. And I would also say, because it's pertinent to what I'll be saying this evening in our conversation, it's also the most centrist. It's the most mainstream of the human rights organizations. And this past week, Human Rights Watch put out a very substantial report. It ran to 214 pages, and it had a voluminous scholarly apparatus, which is the fancy way of saying that it was exhaustively and comprehensively researched. It's an impressive piece of work. And it had many dramatic things to say. The title of the report is A Threshold Crossed. A Threshold Crossed. And before I get to that threshold crossed, I want to just back up a moment and set it in context. The context is that since roughly 2009, Palestinians and their supporters have been trying to bring a case against Israel before the International Criminal Court. And these were very protracted proceedings, and they frankly seemed as if they were getting nowhere. There were two cases brought before the court. One was, after many, many years, finally dismissed by the chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. That was the subject of the book, the title of which you mentioned, I Accuse. It was an attack on the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda. And then there was a second case brought before the court. The second case was also dragging and dragging and dragging, and it looked as if it was going to die out. However, this past year, for reasons which I won't go into now, the court finally decided it's proceeding with an investigation into Israeli war crimes against Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza. Now, one hurdle had been cleared to pursue this investigation, but there were still many other hurdles to be cleared. I myself, having followed the case closely and studied it, I was very skeptical the Palestinians would be able to clear the next hurdles. There are a lot of legal technicalities which would have enabled the court to kill the case. And I didn't think that they would be able to prevail, the Palestinians. But then, lo and behold, about 3 months ago, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, which is the main Israeli human rights organization monitoring Israeli crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories, it came out with what one might call an astonishing position paper. And I'm just going to read you the title. I'm not going to belabor you with the text, just the title. A regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, this is apartheid. A regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, this is apartheid. Now, there are three notable things about that title. Number one, they use a very incendiary phrase. The phrase is Jewish supremacy. Now, obviously, for an American ear, that sounds an awful lot like white supremacy, Jewish supremacy. There's not even a fleece hop separating the two. So to a public which has been, mostly because of the Black Lives Matter movement, very much sensitized to issues of Jewish supremacy and Jewish domination, white supremacy and white domination, it was, as I said, an incendiary phrase. Secondly, usually in discussions of the Israel-Palestine conflict, there's Israel here and the occupied Palestinian territories there. Israel's legitimacy is more or less accepted. The point of contention is the state and future of the occupied Palestinian territories. B'Tselem did something new. It said, we're no longer talking about Israel here, occupied Palestinian territories there. There's just one state now. You have to be honest about it. There's just one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And that one state is Israel. And that one state is a Jewish supremacist state. As the report goes on to say, this state is built on, its foundation is Jewish supremacy. And then it takes the next step and says this is an apartheid state. Well, that crossed several red lines. Number one, it no longer acknowledged the legitimacy of the state of Israel. The point of contention was no longer just the occupied Palestinian territories. It's the whole thing. And number two, they compared it to apartheid. And for Israel's supporters, that's been a bogey. You can't compare it to apartheid. So this was a development which, frankly, speaking candidly, I was shocked. I was very surprised at what they did. They have a new leadership. The fellow who heads the executive director is a fellow named Hagai Elad. A very unusual figure. I don't know him personally. I would never had contact, not from a wanted trying by me, but we've never had contact. He's a Harvard PhD. He's a Harvard PhD in physics, and he apparently set aside his professional attainments, and he now heads up B'Tselem. And he's a remarkably principled and forthright person. There are some quite amusing exchanges between him, or one amusing exchange between him and the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, and the United Nations. It's a real sight to behold. And frankly, I personally thought, and still think, he has gone so far out on the limb that there's probably a good chance he will be assassinated. Now, the B'Tselem report didn't get all that much attention. It was not reported in the New York Times. However...
Jesus Christ, it wasn't? Oh my God. I mean, I shouldn't be surprising, but wow.
But now, the next shoe dropped. The Human Rights Watch report.
So just so people are clear, so B'Tselem is like the first and foremost human rights organization in Israel, right? Is that...
The main Israeli human rights organization monitoring Israeli crimes and abuses. I don't like the word abuses, I prefer crimes. Israeli crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories. It's very reputable. It's won many awards. And I think it's fair to say nobody has seriously disputed the quality or the accuracy of its research. So it's a formidable organization in terms of its persuasive power. It has a good track record for its accuracy. Now, the Human Rights Watch report is as astonishing as the B'Tselem report, but in a different way. First of all, the Human Rights Watch report says not that Israel has established a regime of Jewish supremacy across the board from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. They say something slightly different, but equally incendiary. They say Israel has established across the board from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, they have established a regime, I'll use their words now, a regime of Jewish domination over and against the Palestinian people. And they say that in the occupied territories, Israel has established, or Israel engages in the crime of apartheid and the crime of persecution, and that these two crimes constitute, under international law, they constitute crimes against humanity, which, according to Human Rights Watch, quoting some statutes, they say these are among the most odious, O-D-I-O-U-S, among the most odious crimes in international law. And they say that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, it should not limit itself to investigating Israeli war crimes, but should go to the next step and investigate Israeli crimes against humanity. So it's already taken what you might call out on the limb positions, but I'll get to that in a moment, get back to that in a moment. The other thing it does, which was a total surprise to me, I'm not saying these things for their theatrical or emotive effect. I'm being quite sincere, candid with you. I've studied this conflict since 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. It eventually became the topic of my doctoral dissertation. And so I'm pretty inured to events in the Israel-Palestine conflict. I kind of think I've seen it all. But I do think some things are really happening which are very surprising. It's the 1960s song that I grew up with. There's something happening here. There is. Something is happening. There's no doubt about it. Because the Human Rights Watch report doesn't just stick to the present. What is the situation now? What has been the situation in the past 10 or 20 years? The B'Tselem report is basically a description of the present. The Human Rights Watch report, I'm not exaggerating. Believe me, I don't exaggerate. I'm very careful about staying true to the facts. It goes all the way back to Israel's establishment in 1948. It even goes back to 1947. And it says, from the beginning, Israel, in order to create this Jewish state, the Zionist movement and then the state of Israel, they tried to do two things. Number one, they tried to, I'm using their words now, engineer a Jewish majority in Israel. Because for the founders of the state of Israel, a Jewish state could not be a Jewish state unless there was a Jewish majority. And so they wanted to engineer that Jewish majority. Well, there was only one way to engineer the Jewish majority. You had to expel the indigenous population. There was no other way to do it. And so Human Rights Watch, it delegitimizes the notion of, or the legitimacy of, an objective of a Jewish majority. Because it says in order to create that Jewish majority, it could only be created at the expense of the Palestinians. And so it says this creation of a Jewish majority state was intrinsically at the expense of or discriminating against the Palestinian population. The second pillar of the Jewish state objective was the confiscation of the land, because the land was owned by Palestinians. They lived there. When Israel was created, only 6% of the land was owned by Jews. So, or 6% of the land in Palestine was owned by Jews. So, they describe in really, I would call it searing detail, even though I know that's a kind of catchphrase. They describe this in searing detail, this juggernaut, this maw, which is gobbling up the Palestinian land, dispossessing the Palestinians of their land. And to the point that to create the Jewish majority, 90% of the indigenous population was expelled, about 750,000 Palestinians. Now, with their descendants, Human Rights Watch gives a figure of 5.7 million Palestinian refugees. And then on the other end, they say that Israel controls 93% of the land, the state-owned land. And that 93% is earmarked only for Jews. Palestinians constitute 19% of the population of the state of Israel, about 1.6 million people, and they are confined to about 3% of the land. To cut to the chase, and to make a long story a little bit shorter, the effect is, and I wish, it's hard for your generation, or probably most of your listeners, to appreciate the long and the short of the report. And I'm not quite sure if the Human Rights Watch is really aware of what they were doing. And honestly, I'm not sure. But the long and the short of the report is, it completely delegitimized the idea of a Jewish state. It said a Jewish state is inherently discriminatory and in critical respects, in order to create and preserve until today, in order to create or engineer and to preserve till today a Jewish state, Israel committed many inhuman acts, crimes against humanity, inhuman acts. The massive forcible eviction of people from their homes, the massive illegal confiscation of the land of the Palestinians. And there are two things to say to that, and then I kind of would like a dialogue with you, if you don't mind. There are just two things I would want to say to that. Is number one, what's happening now in East Jerusalem, you just see it when you read the Human Rights Watch report, you see it as part of this juggernaut that began in 1947, this relentless, heartless confiscation of Palestinian land. They just don't stop. You know the expression? The hunger increases with the eating. The more they consume that land, the more they want more and more and more. And so after reading the report, you see what's happening now in East Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah. You just see it as one more step in this long trajectory, this relentless, heartless juggernaut, this maw of stealing the land from those hopeless, helpless, and hapless people. That's one point. The second point I would make is where I began, where I said, we left off a few moments ago. Human Rights Watch is a mainstream organization. It's not a radical organization. They don't watch its leadership. They don't watch Useful Idiots. They don't watch Rising. They watch NPR. They listen to NPR. They read the New York Times. In their leisure, they read the New Yorker. They probably subscribe to the New York Review of Books. Probably maybe a few subscribe to the London Review of Books. They're very mainstream, very conventional. They're also very Jewish. Kenneth Roth, the executive director.
Shonda. He was on the Shonda list.
No comment. This is the mainstream progressive and centrist Jewish community. And they're very dependent on Jewish donors. Their biggest donor, I haven't followed their funding in recent years, but they received a humongous donation from George Soros, It was a spectacular number. I can't remember now. If you Google it, just to George Soros, Human Rights Watch. And so they must be very sensitive to how far they can go on the Israel-Palestine conflict before they lose their donors and they lose their constituency, which tells me that having done the calculations, they reached the conclusion that their donors and their constituency were ready, were prepared, could digest a human rights report issued by HRW, which not only condemns Israeli policy in the occupation, and describes this policy as the crime of apartheid, the crime of persecution, and those two crimes, apartheid and persecution, are crimes against humanity under international law, which, as I say, constitute among the, quote, most odious crimes in international law. They went not only that far, but they described the whole regime from the Jordan to the Mediterranean as one based on Jewish domination, which, as I'm sure you recognize, is only a flea's hop from saying Jewish supremacy. They're pretty much synonymous. And what's most, in my opinion, as, not more, but as revelatory, they said all this on the assumption, in my opinion, that they wouldn't lose their Jewish constituency. They were ready to say the idea of a Jewish state, at least as it's been constructed in Israel, is illegitimate under international law. That to build a state, create a state, built on the premise and principle of a Jewish majority, and by confiscating nearly the whole of the land to be used only by and for Jews, which is what the Jewish state has meant the last 73 years, as a practical matter. As a practical matter, it's meant the Jewish majority and the confiscation of the land by, and for the Jewish people. No? It delegitimized the idea of a Jewish state, and that just shocked me. As I said, I'm not fully persuaded they realized what they were doing, but that's the bottom line. It's definitely the bottom line. The bottom line is, henceforth, the paradigm is no longer Israel here, occupied Palestinian territories there. Israel, for better or for worse, we accept it as it is. Occupied Palestinian territories, we don't accept. The occupation has to end, and a Palestinian state has to be created. That was the paradigm up until now. Now, the whole legitimacy of the state of Israel as a Jewish state has been called into question.
On Israel, in your opening statement, when you talk about supporting Israel's right to defend itself, that includes, I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that includes their retaliatory strikes against Hamas targets in Gaza, right?
We're speaking of the principle of self-defense. We certainly.
I'm asking if you think that the principle of self-defense applies to the retaliatory, the airstrikes that they're conducting in response.
Matt, this is a very fluid situation. I would hesitate to comment on operations beyond, the rocket fire that is clearly targeting innocent civilians in Israel. So I would hesitate to speak to specific operations that have just occurred. But the broader principle of self-defense is something we stand by on behalf of Israel and every other country.
Do you think that an Israeli military response to the rockets coming in, the military response to the rockets coming in is covered by this broader rubric of self-defense, right?
Self-defense often does authorize the use of force.
There was
Said.
Thank you, Matt. I want to ask you about East Jerusalem, but let's talk about what you said about the principle of self-defense. Does that in any way apply to the Palestinians? Do they have a right to self-defense? Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
In broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state. I don't think that. I certainly wouldn't want my words to be construed as.
I understand. I want to ask you on Israel. I don't want to harp on this either, but the Israelis killed 13 people just now. Including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging.
when in fact one side had F-35s, they're bombing the Palestinians. In fact, that's the only place on earth where the F-35 has been used in combat. And the others have stones. I mean, what is this both sides thing? One side is occupying and the other side is being occupied. Could you care to explain what is the both sidism here?
Well,
Extremely brief. One, in your response to Saeed's earlier question about whether the Palestinians have a right to self-defense, your answer, you're going to know as soon as I read what your answer was, that there's a big problem with it. You said, well, not a problem, it just doesn't answer the question. We believe that it, meaning the right to self-defense, applies to any state. Well, you see the problem, right? Yes?
do you want to?
Do you regard Palestine as a state?
I wasn't
Do you
referring.
think that, do you don't in the context of the ICC and the UN. So are you saying that you do not, if it applies to any state, are you saying that Palestinians don't have a right to self-defense?
I was making a broader point, not attached to Israel or Palestinians in that case.
So they do have a right to self-defense.
Matt, I'm not in a position to debate the legalities
right.
from up here. What our message is one of de-escalation.
الله يزعل على قلبه.
حالها خليك. رفع الله.
I'm shocked. I can't believe it. Our children were playing in front of our house peacefully. They were hit by a bomb. After we heard it, we rushed outside to find the children lying on the ground. Please stop killing our kids, for God's sake. What would they do if it were their children? Enough is enough. They've done enough to us. We're not resistance fighters or militia. We're not killing anybody. We're peaceful citizens standing in front of our houses. Peaceful people who do not carry guns, knives or weapons. Why are they doing this to us?
My kids were killed. Both of them were very young. One was 11 and the other was 7 years old, playing near me. They were playing only 30 meters away from me. My nephews were playing with them too, and a young guy called Ahmed, who was getting married in a few days. They were playing and I was calling them. They were looking at me when suddenly I saw a missile land right in the middle of them. God, my heart is broken. I lost my heart along with my children. God help me.
But talking about COVID-19, by the way, the unfortunate thing is that while Israel managed to vaccinate almost the whole of its population eligible for vaccination, they completely ignored their duty as an occupying power, and they denied us the right to have the vaccines. So practically, they created what I call medical apartheid. And the result of that is that in the West Bank, 750,000 illegal settlers received the vaccine, and 3.1 million Palestinians did not receive anything. And that's why the vaccination in the West Bank and Gaza is dragging, while in Israel, it's the best place in the world. This occupation into a system of racial discrimination. according to Human Rights Watch, which is a highly respected human rights organization, and even Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, they both say that Israel has established a system of racial discrimination and apartheid, which is considered by international law as a war crime. And not only that, that Israel has established a system of persecution, which is also another criminal war act. So, in my opinion, supporting Israel with weapons and staying silent about the crimes that are conducted is unacceptable. And let me also remind you that during the last month, what we had is Israeli army attacking people who were trying to pray in the mosques, in Al-Aqsa Mosque. I myself have witnessed what the Israeli soldiers did. They attacked people for no reason.
But can you please just give a broad sense of what the administration is trying to achieve in the Middle East? For example, does the administration still consider the Saudis and the Israelis important allies?
Again, I think there are ongoing processes and internal interagency processes. One that I think, confirmed an interagency meeting just last week to discuss a range of issues in the Middle East. Where we've only been here 3.5 weeks, and I think I'm going to let those policy processes see themselves through before we give kind of a complete lay down of what our national security approaches will be to a range of issues.